Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Patrick.
Hello.
Welcome to the call.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Happy for you to join us today, this morning. I understood Patrick is joining us today from Toronto instead of New York, as it happens. And Miki and I, my name is Irmeli. We are sitting here in Helsinki, or Espoo to be correct. So welcome to join us in our last webinar during the first half of this year. And today we will be discussing geopolitical tensions, which is, well, very timely topic today, and we will be looking at things in particular from the perspective of the NVIDIA case, a public case. We don't really have anything to do with NVIDIA specifically, but we're using it as an example just because it's there's plenty of information available on that publicly listed company, and it's very much at the heart of geopolitical tensions, as we know. Just a couple of practicalities before we get going. We will be recording this webinar and making the recording available to everyone. And also we invite questions and comments throughout the webinar. We will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat section. So whenever you feel like you want to comment on something or ask questions, we will be picking those up as we go along. But without further ado, I mean, in our little preparation sections, the gentleman already got going, and we had a lively discussion going on. So without further ado, I think Miki and Patrick, you could take the floor and start here.
Yeah, thank you. And before we go to the actual topic, I'm always interested in our guest's background and what's the angle to the topic at hand. So Patrick, could you tell a bit about your background and what are you doing also currently?
Thank you very much. So my name is Patrick Fruchet. I live in New York City. I'm in Toronto today because there was fog in Toronto last night, and so I didn't make my flight to New York last night. I am a geopolitical risk advisor. I advise mostly U.S. companies, U.S. management teams on geopolitical risk. That consists of working with management teams to define their own risk tolerances, their own way of working with geopolitical risk, and to help them make structured decisions based on evidence in a setting where there's an enormous amount of daily noise coming out of the headlines about geopolitics, and it's trying to get from that noise the signal that tells us what is of material importance to a particular executive team. My background is I worked for the UN for many, many years in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and other hotspots. And so my background is very much in the sort of peace and peace and conflict settings. In that context, I spent a lot of time thinking about geopolitical risk because I was delivering major projects in policing and in corrections and more generally in security sector reform around the world, often with European funding and often in very, very austere conditions. And so I've taken that experience and am now applying that in what I call enterprise geopolitics. Thank you.
Interesting. Sounds a bit familiar, as I've been working for 20 years in conflict and peace mediation sphere myself as well. But on that topic, what you see that these sort of enterprise customers, what kind of understanding they are lacking in the bigger picture about geopolitics? What are the sort of blind spots, if you will, in comparison to you who have been actually living through quite many different geopolitical shocks, at least locally and regionally before?
So it's not an information problem, right? So the information is available. It's available in the daily headlines. It's available in weekly reporting. It's available everywhere. So but what it seems to me is lacking is frameworks to translate that into the so what question at the enterprise level. And so there's this concept of materiality that comes from the ESG world. And so when you talk about ESG, you talk about material risks. In geopolitics, we don't yet have enterprise material risk definitions that are broadly understood. So very often companies are using their existing tools and trying to grip geopolitical risks that are fast moving and often fairly brittle. Like you go from one situation to another situation literally overnight, and people are lacking sort of the frameworks to take risks based on those geopolitical realities with their management teams. There's not a lot of experience in the room very often about dealing with these types of risks, dealing with the various stakeholders that matter when these sorts of risks eventuate. And that's my job. My job is to sort of help management teams build the frameworks, build the sort of decision architecture to be able to soberly and carefully, on the basis of their fiduciary responsibilities to their stakeholders, manage risks and in some cases take risks in a controlled and informed fashion.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. So I feel that the geopolitical risk is so wide area that there's no tools, competence, nor resources to actually monitor and understand properly the world's development and think really through the implications and the impacts, and thus what are the preparedness plans for different scenarios and risks. Going towards the topic of today, I was preparing for this webinar, looking at some material that I prepared with our Claude environment, and I was trying to prompt some questions, and I was like, why isn't it working in now? And tried and retried to prompt things that I did last Thursday, and it didn't allow me to do that. And then there was a pop-up that go to the Anthropic website and see this news. And there was the news that U.S. government issued an export control directive on the national security authorities, requiring that Anthropic will suspend all access to Fable 5 and Meteos 5 for foreign nationals. So now I'm not able to use the same AI than you, which is the frontier, the best models. So this really, is timely topic for the sort of AI sovereignty and more widely sort of disruption of the geopolitics into the data and AI field. What do you make of this news?
So it's very interesting. So I am an American citizen, and so theoretically I have access to Fable 5. And if I was working for one of the companies that has access to Mythos, I would have access to Mythos. I don't have access to it either, right? So the tool that they had at their disposal was just to turn it off. So everyone worldwide has lost access to this tool. I would imagine they will figure out a way to turn America back on before they turn anybody else back on. But I think it goes to a broader point, which is that Anthropic, of the American AI companies, has been fairly vocal about the need for measured and careful regulation. And I think that several days ago they put out a statement saying we need to think through how to regulate ourselves and regulate our sector. The tendency in the United States has been to have very unregulated AI. And to sort of let the sort of Wild West, if you will, happen. The data center real estate scene is extraordinary. Like what real estate in the middle of nowhere in Texas is going for multiples of what its underlying value is, because Texas has an unregulated energy market, which means that there's tons of access to power in Texas. But the narrative on AI is basically, well, we the Americans have to keep going because the Chinese models are going to catch up with us if we don't. And so just as I said earlier, geopolitics can be very brittle. The brittleness came at the weekend where, the Trump administration went from a laissez-faire attitude to a cancel the whole thing attitude overnight. And there were signs that they might be doing that, but very weak signals that something like that was going to be coming. And even if you thought it might be coming, what were you going to do about it? And we can have a longer conversation about resilience and how you manage, systemic shocks like the Anthropic situation a little bit later if you want, Mickey.
Absolutely. So if you sort of would describe, how do you see the development of this sort of international system, geopolitics unraveling today? Do you have a theory or overarching idea what's going on now in the world?
Yeah. I do. So my theory is sort of born in Europe, and I will digress for 1 second and sort of talk a little bit. So the part of my background I didn't talk about is I have a degree from the London School of Economics in International Relations Theory. So in the 1600s, the system of states that we now know, countries, came into being. There was a 30 Years' War, there was a Treaty of Westphalia, and basically there was this concept of what we now think of as states or nation states or countries came into being in Europe in the 1640s. By the 1960s, with decolonization, basically the nation state was everywhere. The state system is enduring. So there have been for hundreds of years states, and I believe that there will be for hundreds of years in the future states as the basic building block of the international system. Now, the international order is something else. We are living now in what may be the twilight days of what has been called the rules-based international order. So the post-World War II rules-based international order, born of the horrors of the Second World War, and seeing the emergence of the United States of America as a player that chose to invest in fighting the Nazis eventually, and helped bring an end to World War II, helped establish institutions like the United Nations, and saw a lot of benefit to itself from leading in the rules-based international order for various reasons, which we can get into. The United States is not necessarily feeling that its leadership in the international order as it stands today is benefiting the United States as much as it might have thought it did some time ago. That's debatable. It's a debate worth having, but that is certainly the feeling in the United States. And as we can talk about later, a lot of it has to do with the rise of China, which has been a concern certainly for the last two presidents of the United States.
Yeah, and we'll get to the current dynamics. I know you have a lot to say about the current administration's policies. We'll get to that, but that was a good framing. We know that the international system is very much now, questioned at least from the sort of US side of the pond, but certainly now the new alliances are also forming because of the policies that's forged there. But let's also talk about sort of NVIDIA's case study. We were discussing how to illustrate the analysis of geopolitical risk from an enterprise perspective, and you asked us. I said that I can take any company and show the sort of how our tools and sort of methods can adopt to different kind of cases, and you proposed that we would be looking at NVIDIA's open source sort of risk information and analyze that. We know that NVIDIA is hugely important for the global economy and sort of reflects the tension between East and West and critical minerals and building GPUs for autonomous vehicles, AI data centers and everything. How would you frame the importance of NVIDIA for the world economy?
So NVIDIA, started out making chips for video games, and all of a sudden it became something that is underpinning the AI revolution. And so the need to have chips and to use those chips is core to using AI. And so it's an American company. It's an American publicly traded company. It has manufacturing subcontractors all throughout the world, including in Taiwan. And it is, it is a core technology, so much so that, again, there are US export restrictions on the most advanced NVIDIA chips, and there is a Chinese move afoot to either build its own GPU factories or to find ways of using the chips it has access to in a more efficient fashion so as to not be quite so reliant on a technology that the US government can restrict.
Absolutely. And there we, of course, then have the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, which is then, hugely dependent on NVIDIA and vice versa. So we will get into the sort of Taiwanese question, but do you want to elaborate on what's behind the tensions between China and Taiwan? I guess it's familiar to most people that it's sort of traditional geopolitical question of disputed territory, essentially.
Yeah.
Taiwan.
So very briefly, there is Taiwan is a self-declared independent state. It's recognized as such by almost nobody. There is this game where every once in a while, a certain African state or small Caribbean nation will recognize Taiwan in exchange for certain financial concessions. And then the Chinese government in Beijing will get upset. But in effect, nobody really recognizes Taiwan, including the United States of America. But the United States of America maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity as regards Taiwan. And what that means is that the United States suggests that it may come to Taiwan's aid if Taiwan is invaded or in any way attacked, and that would include a blockade by China. And so it's not Article 5 of NATO. It's not the same as that. It's not as codified as that. But the concept is, or the terminology that gets used is strategic ambiguity. There is some talk that strategic ambiguity may disappear in one way or another with the current administration. But for the time being, and it's built into certainly American military doctrine, the strategic ambiguity approach has been maintained, which means that the Chinese must hesitate before taking any sort of military action as regards Taiwan. The Chinese right now, the feeling is that they don't have the technical capacity to do it. But I think, as we see with all of the wars of the recent past, any suggestion that we know how any one country's ability to project power really happens in the real world, look at the Americans in Iran, look at the Russians in Ukraine, is really something that we need to be questioning, because the fungibility of turning the number of troops we have, the number of tanks we have into actual results in the battlefield is clearly very difficult. And the Chinese have not fought a war against anyone since 1979 when they fought the Vietnamese. And so they are not a battle-tested military. They look formidable on paper, but of course, so did the Russians when they invaded Ukraine.
Truly, and we could talk more and long about this context. But if we go towards this sort of methodology, how to seize and capture these scenarios and risks, I could illustrate one picture that we've been presenting in sort of conjunction with Inclus on how do we approach risk management. We call it as an integrated risk intelligence framework, which always starts from the business context and objectives of the company. And there's typically some sort of risk management process, maybe an enterprise risk management process, but then of course you want to handle geopolitical risk within it. And you want to end up with some sort of situational picture on what are the risks and what are the severity of them. But often we are lagging the question of questioning that what are the missing piece of information of those risks that we can even assess them. And we can then introduce the idea of information requirements, monitoring topics, key risk indicators, to do horizon scanning, or sort of risk intelligence in individual risks, so that we can monitor what's the direction of that risk are we missing any risk? Are there any blind spots in our situational picture? And this process often has been sort of a little bit too distant from the risk management process, so that you get a lot of interesting information. You might actually have a lot of relevant information as well, but do you really need that information in order to manage your risks is another question. So we want to bring those processes closer together, that the information would better sort of serve the risk management process. And then you end up in a question that is your situational picture scenario proof, because it's only a statement of the risk with current day's knowledge, and we know that the situation geopolitically can change now quite rapidly as well, and there's multiple plausible, sort of not necessarily probable, but sort of credible scenarios which are very bad, quite bad, somewhat sort of moderately bad, and moderately good, and so on. So we really need to be able to reflect those different scenarios against the risk situational picture to really be prepared for what's happening and what's going on, and how will Iran at the end turn out. We've been seeing these peace initiatives there, quite predictably falling apart, and now there seems to be some advancement, but certainly no probably long-term military or diplomatic solution there either. So we know that the scenarios do not end in one end state. They always keep on going and coming back. So this is one framework. Does this open to you? I know we've been discussing this earlier on, but how do you see this picture in the big?
So, scenario-based planning is a very useful tool because it gives management teams the ability to build up planning muscle. So it gives management teams the ability to sit together and run a couple of what ifs, medium good to bad to very bad to really, really, really bad. And then to have practiced thinking through various scenarios. And so there's a famous term from military doctrine, which is, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In other words, reality is always different from the scenario. Reality is always different from the plan. But if you haven't done your exercises, if you haven't had a chance to sit with your management team and understand how management team members think and how they express themselves around these types of risks, and you haven't sort of articulated what your risk tolerances are, then you will come to every bump along the road unprepared. And so scenarios are super helpful tools in the work that I do to help management teams center themselves around not the possible, the probable, the range of probable things that it's reasonable to think could happen in the near future, and then be ready for those. But again, because of how dynamic things are, we always have to think about the low probability, high severity event. So the people who had put all their eggs in the fable basket with Claude a couple of days ago and were thinking up whole new ways of running their companies based on that, now have to think again.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And if we go to the NVIDIA case, we sort of studied and researched what we can find about NVIDIA online. So basically we used Inclus AI to fetch information, and there's a bunch of SEC filings, for example, on NVIDIA, where they have to report quite transparently and sort of exhaustively what are the risks of the companies and on the bigger picture, and what are the mitigation measures, how do they see markets evolving, and so on. So this might be a bit sort of unfamiliar for some of the European attendees here, but I guess that in some regards you can get a better sort of view on the risk landscape of the US companies than even European companies due to these filings, or would you say so?
Yeah, so SEC filings are fairly extensive. Companies have the discretion So, to be as frankly as vague or not as they want to be about their risks. There's a lot of companies, for instance, who will be a little bit more vague in their written statements and perhaps elaborate during quarterly earnings calls and do this more in a Q&A way. But at the end of the day, they are liable for underestimating their risk. So if they have engaged in practices that can be reasonably considered deceptive, they expose themselves to an enormous amount of risk from SEC SEC oversight. So there is a tendency. There's a lot of incentives to be very transparent about risks, including geopolitical risks. And in the case of NVIDIA, I think they are very much communicating to various publics when they talk about these risks. And I think that they are very much communicating to a White House that is paying a lot of attention to their firm, but also to a Chinese government that is also paying a lot of attention to their firm. And I think by putting all of this out there, they're saying to both of these governments, hey, you are making it very difficult for us to do business. We're telling our shareholders that. And in the case of the US president, how stocks do and how the economy is looking is very, very important, rightly or wrongly, on a daily basis to how the president of the United States, expresses himself. He takes credit when the stock market goes up.
Yeah, but I guess you could build quite comprehensive risk situation landscape of almost any publicly listed company nowadays, because you can get this sort of risk topics from the publicly listed papers, but then you can of course find new sources from additional sources from think tanks and news reports and so on. So you can really get a good overview on what are their biggest risks. We sort of created a risk library of NVIDIA here, where you would have geopolitical risks like the US-China technology decoupling naturally, but also trying to play on both markets and how that unfold in different scenarios is a key question for NVIDIA. There's export control escalation, gray market diversion of restricted chips, then naturally the TSMC concentration tail risk, where actually the founder of TSMC has said himself that if there would be a sort of escalation of military development with China, the TSMC couldn't operate. So that's sort of fairly radical transparency, of course, quite natural and self-evident in some regards, but that's truly a big risk. Middle East UAE deal fragility, different kind of geopolitical risks. Then we see a lot of regulatory sort of divergence in AI regulation. We know that now we have the AI regulation in Europe. We have a anti-monopoly investigation policy in China, and so on. A lot of sort of regulatory changes, naturally developing automotive sector specific regulation, for example. Then on the supply chain side, naturally a lot of risks as well, and then competitive and market structure risk as well, that there's new sort of competitors rising from Alibaba, Baidu, Cambricon, domestic chip development in China, challenging NVIDIA as well. DeepSeek efficiency model, demand side risk, that the sort of GPUs wouldn't demand, the demand wouldn't be that high going forward due to the efficiency of the AI models and so on. Probably, I don't know how probable these are, but these are some risks that we've been able to sort of gather from the open sources. And where do we go from here is typically sort of the risk identification like here, but naturally want to then understand what is the actual risk and what are the latest developments, so we can use the Inclus AI agent here, that we can gather evidence, for example, on different risks like the gray market diversion of restricted chips and update the risk. So the AI can also create the key risk indicators, what we need to look at when we want to, for example, understand the gray market diversion risk, and then there would be volume and value of NVIDIA Class A AI GPUs appearing high risk jurisdictions without corresponding licenses, shipments in NVIDIA's channel and distribution data, etc., etc. And then we can start finding supporting evidence for these key risk indicators from the latest reporting and news, where we can then, of course, use different kind of sources from public documents to sort of investigative reporting and everything in between. And we can then see what are the sources. We have Financial Times, US Department of Commerce putting out statements. We can then open also the sources directly from the system, providing the evidence behind the assessments as well. So of course, then we need to be very careful on sort of what sources we can rely on and how we want to accept the data into the system. But technically speaking, it's sort of easy to gather the evidence, but also we want not to sort of confirm necessarily always these sort of assumptions that the risks are getting more probable. We also want to find falsifying evidence, possibly, or sort of balancing evidence on whether the risk would be maybe actually reducing. So we can also collect that information. But comes back to the sort of horizon scanning question, and from there we can create a sort of AI baseline assessment. So we can ask the AI even to assess the risks based on the evidence and provide the comments as well. So for example, on DeepSeek efficiency model demand side risk, we can have sort of some justification on why the AI would deem it as critical and likely based on the evidence. We might want to have a look at customer concentration, hyperscaler dependency, and so on. And this is just a sort of course, sort of AI analysis of the risks, but can be kind of interesting to quantify as well. But the core of Inclus is collaborative risk management. So we want to take this information as the background study and information that you can also disagree with to an actual assessment, for example, through the executive committee or the different business unit directors, where we would be inviting people to analyze these risks, and based on the information available, they can then provide their own assessment on the impact of the risk and likelihood, and also provide comments on opportunities, because naturally there's a lot of upside on most of the risk as well, of course, depending on the risk domain. And then they can also justify and comment why they see certain risk as they do. And then we can see how does the AI assessment compare against the sort of collaborative assessment, which could look like this. This is now also generated by AI because we are not working with NVIDIA. I want to state that clearly here. We have been utilizing public information, but we can also provide the AI with guidance that it can look at, for example, the risk assessment from different perspectives, like the chief product officer or CEO, and sort of provide justifications also why they could assess certain risk as it does. So this is kind of interesting how we can start simulating this real world evidence to different kind of assumptions on sort of different perspectives on why the risk could be this or that. So before we go to the scenario analysis, do you want to sort of comment on this methodology? How do you see the sort of
dichotomy
between
absolutely.
the data?
So, So yes, I mean, what is great about this tool is that it gives you something like a map of your exposure. So if you were the NVIDIA management team, you would be able to quibble and disagree with what the AI came up with, but you'd have to respond to it, because what the AI comes up with is some sort of a consensus view out there in the marketplace of ideas about what your company is like based on publicly available information. Now, you're going to have non-public information about your company, and you're going to have non-public information about your company culture, and therefore you might move numbers around. But knowing what what the street, what the opinion in the world is about your company, whether you're NVIDIA or any other company that is well covered, that has a lot of public exposure, I think is really, really useful. I also think what's really, really useful is that if you're someone who needs to use NVIDIA GPUs or rely on suppliers that use NVIDIA GPUs, then you can sort of put NVIDIA in your own risk register and say, okay, what's happening with NVIDIA, and what's the potential impact of what's happening with NVIDIA on my business? And so I think that's very, very useful. And I think that the ability to visualize that and to make it something that you can have be part of a collaborative conversation with one's colleagues, I think is super, super useful. And so using this tool with some of the, falsification is a framing, right? It's a way of thinking about information using a falsification approach. So I think it's a really, really useful tool for management teams to think about their own companies, but also to think about perhaps their competitors or perhaps companies that sit in their supply chains, and understand how those companies' exposure to geopolitical risk may have, again, a material impact on your own enterprise.
Yeah, great comment. And what we often introduce is also the concept of opportunities, like you mentioned, that there's always the upside of risk as well, where we could, for example, on the y-axis put the risk matrix or risk score, essentially sort of combining risk, impact, and likelihood, and we can then see the sort of opportunities on the x-axis. So we can then look at what would be having a high risk score, but then also being huge opportunities as well. And there we can also ask the AI for judgment on why we could possibly see opportunities on this. For example, in this competitive market structure risk, there could be an opportunity to build actual collaborations with one or more competitors, killing the other competitors, and so on. Mm-hmm. So kind of interesting sort of thinking that it sparks, and this is often the view where we can get this sort of CXOs excited, the C-suite sort of thinking that, okay, we are not only looking at threats, and they are more prone to thinking about opportunities, whereas they leave their sort of directors to think about the threats and risks and mitigate those. So this is one cool way to sort of merge those two aspects together. And if we go then to this sort of scenario thinking, as we know that the risk situational picture is often incomplete, and you want to sort of approximate what could be probable and having a big impact. But then we can also create those different scenarios within Inclus. And I wouldn't recommend to use only AI for the creation of scenarios, but it certainly can help the process to be sort of more efficient and provide you at least something to work with in the beginning. So we can look at the risk register and then ask to the AI to create different scenarios based on certain prompt and start creating, for example, bad, best case, and most likely, or whatever sort of method you want to use there. But in this case, there was prompt to create a sort of bad case scenario, essentially a war between China and Taiwan, where there are reports and analysis from RAND and CSIS as well on why this could actually happen and what could be the rationale of Taiwan, Beijing, to actually do this counterproductive sort of attack also to their economy. But as we know, we cannot go to the heads of these sort of authoritarians, as we saw in the case of Putin. Would you have ever attacked a nation of 40 million people in Ukraine with 300,000 soldiers? So probably not, if you just don't think about things logically. So there is some element of of sort of irrationality in geopolitics, which we cannot fully understand. So we have to be prepared for these different scenarios. So bad case scenario, a good case scenario, sort of managed ambiguity, peaceful stalemate, dividend. And then sort of an ugly scenario, what you already referred to in the beginning of this call, that what will be the strategic ambiguity, and actually could US fold and concede Taiwan for China to some degree, either due to sort of domestic dysfunction, or then truly a strategic new position against China. But in this case, Taiwan would be left to the mercy of Beijing, more or less. And then, it's a question of NVIDIA and all other companies working in China, working in Taiwan, whether you can actually serve which markets and play with whom, and so on. Very tricky scenario probably unfolding from there. But we can then reflect these back to the risks. But before we go there, do you want to sort of say a couple of words about how sort of credible you see these scenarios?
So I think with these scenarios, specifically these ones, I think if you're a decision maker and you're trying to look at the range of the possible, these represent places on the continuum of the possible, some, pretty nasty scenarios, and then some, not so bad continued systems management scenarios. I think when it comes to this particular set of dynamics where you have a rising China coming to meet an America that is no longer sure that it wants to lead, the possibility that some sort of, and again, I'm going to go back to European history, even though I sit on the wrong side of the pond. There used to be a thing called the Concert of Europe. It was the bigger powers in Europe got together every once in a while and made decisions that impacted the smaller powers in Europe. They carved up Europe among them. There is, I think, in the minds of certain American leaders and in the minds of certain Chinese leaders, a version of that is now global, that there are spheres of influence, that we should be in charge of this part of the world, you should be in charge of that part of the world, and we will trade between these large blocks, but that we will accept that there's a leader for every part of the world, as it were. And so I think that there is a way of thinking about that, where you say, well, of course you concede Taiwan to China, but you then say, but we want privileged trading access for American companies. We want some sort of a agreed to free port or some agreed to free trade zone where American, LLM companies, American data centers, American what have you, continue to have unfeathered access to the manufacturing capacity that TSMC provides to NVIDIA in this case. And that's a bilateral agreement between China and the United States, and frankly, cuts out Europe, right? So I think there is this sort of idea of worlds, of managing the world order in a more bipolar way, as we would have remembered from the Cold War, whereas the Americans are on one side of the bipolar equation and the Chinese are on the other side. And so there again, you can have a China that takes over Taiwan, but it doesn't necessarily have that much of an impact on American trade relations, because you're able to manage the ongoing access to the technology, for instance.
Yeah, truly, but quite a bad scenario for Europe, probably if that would be the sort of end game of this.
Yeah, it's quite a bad scenario for Europe. It is quite a bad scenario for Europe, and I think that there's, because I imagine most of the people on the line are Finnish. There is this idea coming from out of Finland, coming from your head of state, of this idea of the West and the East, and I think your head of state has hedged his bets lately and sort of said, well, we're not sure the Americans are quite behaving the way we want them to behave, this concept of a unified West. And so I think that's really, I think what's happening here is this notion of a unified West is suspect, right? Many of us would like to think that the idea of a unified West will hold, but it's not at all clear right now. As I sit in Toronto, which has a very punchy relationship, Canada has a very punchy relationship with the United States for the first time in a very long time. It's not at all clear that that's what's going to happen. And you can say, well, it's just this one president. I'm not sure about that. I think that now that tariffs are now back in the world, and now that there is sort of this neo-mercantilist tendency that has reemerged, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that it's a thing where that doesn't survive this particular president, and that doesn't become baked into American politics. Because let's remember that, you know, the people who are aligned on the left with someone like Bernie Sanders, who's also a non-traditional character, were also very, very much in favor of tariffs and of protectionism on behalf of the American worker.
Yeah, I guess our head of state, President Alexander Stubb, should wrote a book about the new sort of world order called The Triangle of Power, sort of after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, sort of with the idea that there would be now sort of three power centers. But then he said that in a couple of weeks, also that book got obsolete, because now the Western alliance is also sort of failing, and sort of that it's a question that whether that will be the global order at the end of the day either. Of course, naturally, we want to uphold the Western values and the systems and norms and institutions in the biggest sort of interest, of course, and emphasize and remind the colleagues in the US that you helped to create this order, and now you're dismantling it. That should we actually come back to those norms and values that actually united us and why they were actually made. And now I think that the sort of normative power is lying in Canada, for example, with Mark Carney's leadership on sort of value-based realism, in a sense. That's the concept of Finnish foreign policy now, but very much adopted by Canada, where you are at the moment. But yeah, that's a big question, truly. But if we want to then look at how we can reflect these scenarios back to the situational picture, so we can see that the current risk assessment would be quite severe already in the AI baseline assessment, at least, that there's multiple likely and critical. I wouldn't imagine that the company themselves would see this as critical as here, but this can be some sort of baseline. And if we then provide the AI a simulation or text of the scenario and ask which risk would amplify in the bad case scenario, we can then see sort of category by category which risk would amplify and why to the higher or more critical or probable direction. For example, an export control escalation policy unpredictability would be almost certain, naturally, in that scenario, as there would be strict controls restrictions for NVIDIA's products in key regions and so on. So this is now, of course, indicative the illustration how these risks might be moving, but certainly the sort of end analysis should be done by humans. But the AI can give you an idea to what direction certain risks are going, or if there are certain risks that actually are alleviating or mitigating due to any scenario. So we can change the scenario from scenario and see how they would be affecting the sort of baseline assessment. It's only one way to look at these scenarios, how it will amplify the current existing known risks. But naturally, we want to do an analysis on what are the overarching impacts of these scenarios to strategy, finances, markets, value chains, and so on, more in detail. But this is just one way to quickly reflect any scenario against your risk profile. And you certainly should validate this analysis by humans. But have you used something like this in your work previously, or do you see this useful?
So again, I see this as entirely useful. Like I used to do a lot of this, before AI. I would have in the UN system, we call them program officers. They work for you, and they bring you these sorts of things. They do them in Excel, and you sort of once a month you update your scenarios. And I think what's really helpful about this is, again, if you use the AI well, and it has to be done well, you can reflect what is out there in the marketplace of ideas, right? And you may not agree with it, and you may say, and you shouldn't necessarily agree with it, because the marketplace of ideas tends to be a sort of lowest common denominator average of various perspectives. And if you know your industry well, and if you're an expert in your industry, then you should have a much more sophisticated understanding of what those broad realities matter, how those broad realities matter to you. And so you would have to be very suspicious about your own reasoning if you took what the AI said at face value. That said, it's a good place to start, and it's much better than seeing this stuff once a month on the basis of an Excel spreadsheet. And so I think it's a tremendously useful starting place for, decision makers to take into consideration, and then make decisions and see how that goes, and ideally reflect back on the impact of one's own decisions into the Inclus tool, based in sort of the proprietary side of the Inclus tool, the stuff that is not based on public information, and saying, okay, we made this decision, it resulted in this outcome that wasn't quite what we expected, and therefore we adjust our risk register, as you would, to the new reality that came as a result of our stimuli. Because what's interesting about geopolitics, like so many other things, is that the other side fights back. It's not like the weather, right? You can model weather risk, and you can say, okay, I'm going to batten down the hatches. Well, the weather doesn't attack you harder because you batten down the hatches. It just does what it was going to do anyway. If you are a company and you make a geopolitical decision that favors China over the United States, it may be that the United States will retaliate against you, right?
Yeah, truly.
Or in the case of Anthropic, very famously, they decided to not be entirely supportive of every aspect of what the America wanted to do with its so-called Department of War, and they had certain restrictions on autonomous weapon systems, and they got labeled a supply chain risk by the so-called Department of War. I mean, that's a material impact on that company. And so it has to be taken into consideration. So being able to reflect those sorts of happenings in a system like the Inclus system, so that management teams can hold themselves accountable for the decisions that they take, I think is a really key tool, a really key feature that I'm hoping to be able to use with my clients.
Truly, and we go to we have about 7 minutes, so we have to have this perhaps the most interesting discussion in a sort of nutshell. But the ugly case scenario is also somewhat driven by the U.S. internal development, and you could argue perhaps the sort of waning power of the U.S. in some regards in having to make deals with China and so on. But if we look at purely the domestic situation in the U.S., we've been looking at certain indicators of a significant internal political crisis. And there's issues on political violence, militia groups threatening elected officials, states refusing to certify federal elections, Supreme Court decision ignored, trust in journalism, declare of emergencies, use of the sort of National Guard and ICE and so on. So a lot of varying evidence. If we just look at what has been the development during the past 3 years, of course, this is not historically indexed or weight or balanced information here. But if we just look at the rate and pace of issues that you're facing in your republic at the moment, I feel that it is likely that the US will end up with a significant internal crisis within the next 3 years. Naturally, we all know some of these reasons, and how bad the situation can get or will get, that's the question. But I do not feel that even after sort of midterm elections in Democrats taking even both houses, that Trump would just start playing golf and sort of concede. I think he's not going to let go of power, and what that would then entail is an interesting question, and I hope that I'm wrong. So can you shed some light from that side of the
Yeah,
coin?
I mean, I to be very frank, I think you're wrong. I mean, I think that and I think we see it. I think we see it in so a lot of what is coming out of the United States right now looks fairly ugly, right? The putting of one's name on buildings illegally, and the building of arches, and all of this sort of kind of symbolic behavior that reminds one of authoritarian leaders from various parts of the world is very disconcerting and is disorienting. And I think it's designed to be disorienting. I think it's designed to make people not necessarily think about the price of fuel today, and to instead think about cage matches on the White House lawn or what have you, because we had a cage match on the White House lawn yesterday. And so, but I do think that what I think needs to cut through all this noise is that the courts are holding, and the court's decisions are being respected. So, the renaming of the Kennedy Center, the Trump Kennedy Center, was challenged in the courts. The court made a decision, and on Friday, the letters that make up the name Trump were physically removed from the side of the building. And so, to date, there has been no suggestion by any quarter that court decisions will not be upheld. Now, that we're in a scenario where we have to rely on the courts, the three co-equal branches of government being the executive branch, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts. The fact that we have to rely on the courts to function as a co-equal branch of government is in and of itself remarkable, because it frankly should be the Congress that is saying, well, no, we're going to, the tone is going to be different coming out of the Congress, and therefore the freedom of maneuver that the White House feels it has wouldn't be there. But that's not the scenario. The scenario right now, and it may change in November once we have fresh leadership being elected into the House of Representatives and into the Senate. But for now, we're having to rely on the courts, and that's as designed. The United States is a 250-year-old country. It's the world's oldest democracy. It was born a revisionist actor by being this world's oldest democracy. As a revisionist actor, it likes to think of itself as being different from other countries. It certainly is different from other countries. It's wanted to shed its leadership of the so-called rules-based international order. And a lot of that has to do, and you're right, Mickey, that there is a view in the United States that is certainly shared across both sides of the aisle, that the American worker has had a bad deal of it in the last 20 or so years, right? And so the American worker is the American voter. And so the parties are vying for the attention and the votes of the American worker. And the American worker has been told that the jobs have gone to Mexico and the jobs have gone to China. And so the United States feels that its leadership of the rules-based international order, or the certain voices is not as beneficial to the United States as it once was, and therefore it's looking to renegotiate the deal. And that, from a European perspective, it undermines the transatlantic partnership, and therefore is very, very disconcerting for America's, World War II European partners, post World War II European partners. And so I understand the concern.
Yeah, but I truly hope that I'm wrong and you're right. But hey, Patrick, so great to have you with us. And Irmeli, if you can say just a few words then.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Patrick, for sharing your thoughts. And we obviously we could have gone on, and this is not like the end of it. So let's continue. Just a couple of words of advertisement. We have our AI ebook fresh out of the oven, so you can download it through the QR code. And then you can also, if you want to contact Patrick directly through LinkedIn, there's a QR code for that. And obviously you can also then follow LinkedIn. follow Inclus on LinkedIn. Anyway, thanks everyone for your time today, and we wish you a great summer break. Whenever it's going to be for everyone, we will continue these webinars in August, and we'll let you know about that later on. But enjoy your summer, and thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.